Uh, uh, we want to welcome again Dr. Richard Ehrhardt from Michigan State University. He will be speaking this second topic about the key considerations in building a commercial flock. There are many good things that he will be sharing. Just remember that you can use the chat to make questions and the question and answer also. And we are going to have our next topic. I will tell you by the end of this, and also sending an email that will be talking Dr. Steve Hart from Langston University about some economics, about winter feeding and some other things, very interesting things, and also economics from University of Missouri, Jennifer Lutz. So both of them will be in our next topic. But now we are going to start with Dr. Richard. So thank you so much, Dr. Richard, for being here with us. It's really an honor for us to have you in this certification. So please go ahead. I don't want to take more of your time.
Well, thank you. That's very kind. I appreciate your invitation and to be a part of program here. And as I think mentioned last time, you're welcome to contact me. Here are my contact information if you'd like me to follow up on some questions you have, and I'll show that slide at the end. So today I'm going to it's a bit of a continuation of the last talk. I'm going to discuss economically important traits, and an important aspect that's often not maybe thought of as a primary consideration is if building a commercial enterprise, you really have to be concerned about some chronic diseases, and some people kind of tend to ignore these, and then they catch up with them, and they're kind of straddled with it lowers the ceiling of their profitability quite a bit and their enjoyment of raising animals. So I'll discuss those. I won't pretend that this is going to be a comprehensive talk. It's going to be more of a primer on chronic diseases. Okay. So let's start off, and I'm going to use some sheep examples here. Try to use sheep and goat language, but you can feel confident if you raise meat goats that these production parameters will apply well to goats as well. They weren't necessarily studied in goats, but logic dictates that they're also very important. So replacement rate is one of the key considerations. That's just simply defined as the percent of your flock you have to replace every year. And this is going to be impacted by things like just your selection program, how hard you select your animals. So you just might choose to cull animals that are less productive. Also, just animals that get, say, for example, mastitis is a major culling factor. Animals that die for whatever reason. And if you have a chronic disease issue in your flock, which we'll talk about later, that's going to increase your replacement rate. So it's the number of ewes that you have, or does you have to replace a year. That's another consideration is conception rate, of course. I think everyone understands what that means, expressed as percent. Lamb mortality, of course, lamb mortality is always greatest in the first minute of life, if you will, and it kind of it declines precipitously after that, hopefully. Lamb weaning weight, number of lambs born per ewe, number of lambs weaned per ewe, which kind of captures mortality as right together. So some of these are better metrics if you think about it for productivity. Maybe a better metric yet could be pounds of lamb weaned per ewe exposed. That kind of captures conception rate, captures mortality, captures growth, right? And then maybe ultimately it should be pounds of lamb sold per ewe per year, because that would also include replacement rate, because the more animals you have to replace, if you're coming from your own flock, the less you have to sell. Okay. So there have been some studied relationships among 9 key traits that to determine the effects of genetic change on production efficiency. So these are some things that have been studied. We have carcass leanness, age of puberty. Those are certainly economically important traits, but as it turns out, maybe not the top of the list. Wool production, well, it wouldn't be too important for some farms, but it could be for wool producers. Milk production is certainly important, but not at the highest point. Neither is growth rate, and necessarily seasonal fertility, especially if you have a flock that gives birth purely in the spring or during the optimal photo period. But if we look at lambs marketed per ewe maintained, it would be the lambing percent, the litter size, and survival would be the three most critical or sensitive traits to select for. If you wanted to consider lambs marketed per ewe maintained per lambing interval, then you'd have to take into account seasonal fertility. So those would be the ones, the real focus areas for profitability would be these particular traits. So we think about factors that determine the lambs sold per ewe per year. I always think of it in three major influences. Of course, genetics. Animals vary a whole lot in their prolificacy. Mature ewes at the same plane of nutrition, just due to their genetic makeup, can vary from just over having singles, which would be like 1.1 lambs per ewe, up to close to triplets for some very prolific breeds. Then we have nutrition, especially nutrition prior to breeding, and those few weeks prior to breeding. People, I guess, would call that flushing most of the time. You can influence lamb litter size quite a bit, up to 25-30%. And so that could be a huge variation and something that you want to recognize. Then we have health. Of course, health is going to affect replacement rate, mortality, growth, all of these factors, and this could also impact number of lambs sold per ewe per year. So what are the right maternal genetics? There's many important traits I'll kind of go through here that you can think about for your maternal line. These the relative importance of these might vary slightly depending on your production system, but I would argue that prolificacy needs to be near the top of your list. It is possible to have too many lambs born per ewe in some production systems, but I'll tell you what, it's rare that people are at that state. Theoretically, yes, but practically rarely does that a problem. Out of season breeding might be an important consideration for your maternal line, especially if you're trying to have year-round production. Milk production certainly is important, and I'll talk about that specifically in a minute. That would be needed to be considered to be matched really to your prolificacy. There's no point in having a huge litter size and not having enough milk to feed the lambs. Generally speaking, the way most prolific sheep are also pretty good milk producers. So usually those things kind of go hand in hand, but could be exceptions. Easy care traits. Now, what is meant by that? That is a whole lot of traits that are sometimes hard to define. A couple easy ones that have been defined by people over the years are simply the teat and udder shape, particularly for, like, if you're in a pasture and the ewes are giving birth, or does are giving birth in pasture environment, big balloon, large teats just don't work, and pendulous udders don't either. And so those are quick, obvious things to call for. Maternal behavior is definitely a heritable trait, but it's a little harder to select for that. But that is part of the easy care selection system, is having ewes that have good mothering ability and appropriate maternal traits. And I'll talk a little bit about maternal behavior and show you some pretty stark differences between breeds, at least. Parasite resistance. 20 years ago, you probably wouldn't have heard a whole lot about parasite resistance as a genetic trait, but that's a very important consideration these days. You're not going to probably select your sheep or goats to the point where they're not going to need to be dewormed, but you certainly can reduce their susceptibility to infection with specific selection I'll talk about. Size. You need to know what size is perfect for your particular target market. That was the subject of my last presentation. And then foraging ability. I put a question mark by this because producers ask me this question quite a lot. They say, which breeds are the best grazers? And generally, I think it's more a question of, having the right late or early maturing genetics. If you have sheep that are very late maturing, like Suffolk sheep, especially the really large framed animals, they don't really do well on forage. They need more grain in their diet. Whereas if you have animals that are more early maturing genetics, like some of the continental breeds and maybe some of the hill breeds for the United Kingdom, they are more early maturing. They tend to put on weight a little easier, have maybe slightly different metabolism as well. Those would be things to consider, but I put a question mark by it because it's kind of hard to measure. So let's speak specifically now to prolificacy and the genetics of prolificacy. As I said, that there's a huge variation in prolificacy. There are some breeds that'll have close to triplets. For example, the Romanoff breed is one of these European short-tail breeds that are very prolific. And these breeds, both Romanoff and Finn, are the two ones in the United States that have really influenced many of our composite breeds. So they have lots of lambs, and they've been very influential. So the Polypay in the United States, if you go over the border to Canada, you'll find they have a breed called the Ehrhardt, which has a lot of Finn breeding in it. They're all composite, pretty much fixed breeds that are well adapted as prolific breeds in these production areas, and more so for more intensive sheep farming systems, not so much for the more pasture-based, slightly more extensive systems. Although crossbreeding with other breeds is common, like using a Polypay cross ewe or a Ehrhardt cross ewe might be more appropriate for some pasture-based systems. So yeah, a lot of people also create their own crosses using Finn or Romanoff germplasm to get that prolificacy. You'll increase your lambing percentage quite a lot with including that blood into your crossbreeding system. I'm just going to mention it, and I'm not going to focus on it, but there is also a particular gene called the F gene or B gene from the Barula merino from Western Australia. Actually, the genes that originally came from India, interestingly enough. The gene is a BMP 15-point mutation, if you want to know that. And it's a specific mutation that creates, just in the single gene, 2 to 3 times greater ovulation. Even in sheep with one copy of the gene have higher ovulation. But the problem I've had with the Barula gene, if you don't put it onto a genetic background that has all the other features you need, like the capacity to rear these lambs, produce milk, it's not going to do you a whole lot of good. So I prefer using as an approach to bring prolificacy in, like these Finn and Romanoff breeds, for example, in sheep, because they kind of bring in all of the other appropriate traits in proportion that are needed to support those extra lambs. So yeah, the Finns were imported in the 60s, been around for a while, highly influential in the United States. The Polypay breed was derived from the Finn, and the Romanoffs came much later. Both of these incidentally came into Canada and then into the United States. The Romanoffs have been very influential, particularly in Canada. If you go into Canada, Quebec in particular, you'll see the Romanoff is a pretty big backbone of many of their commercial sheep. Also, we have some easy care lines of sheep in the United States, some hair sheep lines that Romanoff has been very influential in bringing some added prolificacy into some easy care hair sheep lines in the United States. So moving on to out of season breeding, here's kind of a bit of a list of breeds you might find in North America that tend to breed out of season. I'm going to define that as breeds that have a shallower, shorter non-breeding or an estrus period. They do dip a little bit in fertility, but they don't truly get into a deep estrus. You can rescue them from basically this quiet breeding period just with the presence of rams, pretty much. If you bring rams into their presence, all these ewes will breed. They don't necessarily cycle during the summer, but in the presence of rams, they do. So that's very handy. So there's a number of breeds here that are selected for out of season breeding. Many of our hair breeds are particularly the ones of West African descent. They're from equatorial region of the world. They tend to have pretty aseasonal breeding patterns, because aseasonal fertility, it's pretty much inversely related to latitude. So the higher the latitude, typically the more seasonal, sheep will become, except if you look at these European short-tailed breeds, they're at a very high latitude. They've been selected, so they break the rule, as does the Dorset. So there's a few breeds that kind of break that rule. But generally, if you find sheep that come from the equator, they're going to be fairly aseasonal, with these exceptions of sheep from northern latitudes that are also aseasonal. All right, so milk production is also an important consideration. And I'll just say a word about that in consideration of dairy breeds. So over the years, producers have thought, I want to make my perfect breed of sheep. Seems like they're limited on milk a little bit. So I'm going to bring in some dairy breeds. Now, dairy breeds don't excel in milk at peak lactation. So in the sheep, a peak lactation is about 30 days, but they do excel in they don't decline in milk production. The term for that is persistency. So they're more persistent. They kind of have a long, steady lactation. It doesn't necessarily produce more milk at peak, but they just don't, they're more persistent. They don't have this decline. That's great for like parlor milk production where we're making cheese, but it isn't really that important for lamb production, because we mostly want to have a whole lot of milk available when those lambs are first born for the first 30 or 40 days, which meat sheep already have. So I'd argue that dairy sheep aren't going to do a whole lot bring a lot of added milk to your flock if you're in a meat sheep production system. And I'd say that they have had pretty mixed results. Generally, some of the dairy breeds tend to have higher maintenance udders. They tend to have if you think about it, they've been selected for parlor milk production, not for lambing on pasture. So they tend to have larger teats, and they tend to have a few, I would say, less hardy, maybe slightly more disease prone. And that's actually been documented. They seem to have a few respiratory issues, some of these breeds. And that's not uncommon, because the more we select sheep for a couple single traits like meat, milk, wool, we tend to have sheep that are less fit for survival and maybe more susceptible to a few illnesses. So yeah, no increase in milk at peak in these breeds, so it's not much of a help, really. So I would argue that a sound program would be to select for milk based on these EPDs. That's estimated predicted differences that you get from testing for genetic merit. I'm not going to give you a lecture on genetic selection necessarily here. Perhaps you'll have a little bit of that in this course, but there is a program called the National Sheep Improvement Program in the United States, where there's quite a few breeds that are enrolled in this program, and they have actually quantitative traits for various production traits that give you estimated predicted differences. So they have a particular one for maternal milk. So if you want to buy a Dorset ram who's going to produce, so his daughters are going to have more milk, you can simply buy a ram that has a high EPD for that factor. And that's been pretty successful. I personally have done that for my sheep and seen pretty big differences in litter weights. Not litter size, but litter weights. So EPDs are not available, then you can look at selecting animals based on their adjusted 60-day lamb weights, which is what I do for my paternal lines in my own flock. As far as easy care genetics go, sheep breeds do differ in their mothering ability, and I'm sure there are differences within breeds as well. Although who's really going to be able to measure that easily, right? Their animals differ in their temperament. For example, if you've ever worked with Romanov sheep, they're almost like a deer, like a white-tailed deer. They tend to run away from their offspring. They always come back. I would say they're less amenable to shepherding. They tend to be wild. A lot of the United Kingdom and continental breeds are more similar in temperament and are generally more amenable to shepherding. And again, so sheep that are selected for single traits, whether it be wool, meat, or milk, as I mentioned, tend to have lower survival, or fitness is just a fancy term for survival. And then again, these teat size and udder conformation issues are another thing to look for in easy care lines. And I would argue that anytime, and I don't need to argue, it's in the scientific literature, that anytime we increase crossbreeding, we get a big boost in in weaning weight and survival. So that is something that we want to consider, is having a crossbreeding program, because you kind of have this free thing called a hybrid vigor that gives you better survival and better growth. So yeah, we don't want to be doing this on pasture. We'd rather be doing this, which is simply just taking lambs and getting away from them quickly. Um, and So there are differences in breeds in that regard. Here's an example of some work that was done in Scotland by Kathy Dwyer. It's been a few years since this was published, but it's still quite relevant. What is shown here is see if I can get my pointer to work. What she's showing here is the percent of time that ewes spend grooming their offspring, licking and actively grooming their offspring from birth. So time 0 is birth, and this is the percent of time. So in that first 20 minutes, the first 10 minutes here, these sheep are actively grooming their offspring, as you can, as you've noticed probably in your own production systems. Over time, they do less grooming, so that's general for all breeds. But what they did is they measured this in 2 different lines of sheep. They had Suffolk sheep, which are and they had Scottish blackface sheep, which are more of a hill breed, which are very fit and very well um, uh, adapted to the environment of Scotland. And so they had those pure breeds, which are BB, Scottish blackface ewes with Scottish blackface lambs, Suffolk ewes with Suffolk lambs. Then they did some embryo transfer work where they had Suffolk ewes raising Scottish blackface lambs and Scottish blackface ewes raising Suffolk lambs, giving birth to them. And you can see there's pretty big differences. The kind of blue and orange lines here separate clearly from the yellow and green lines. Yellow and green lines are Suffolk ewes, and they just don't groom their lambs as actively as the Scottish blackface ewes do. And you'll be happy to know that the Scottish blackface nor the Suffolk ewes discriminate based on what their lambs are. They took care of lambs that they were implanted in them just as well as ones of their own breed. So anyhow, that's just an interesting thing. So there's pretty big differences. And this difference in grooming, you say, so what? You know, what does grooming have to do with anything? Well, it is a pretty clear indicator of mothering and survival. They also looked at several other parameters like the time to stand, the time to actively feed, and all of those were clearly different between Scottish blackface and Suffolk ewes. I'm not trying to beat up on Suffolk ewes. They have very important traits that we need in sheep production, but they're just not as fit, and they're not, because they're not they were selected more for meat traits, and you tend to lose these innate survival traits when you do that. It's just an important example. All right, so I'm going to move on to parasite resistance. Pretty different area here, but the main are probably our public enemy number 1 in most of our production systems is going to be Homunculus contortus, the barber pole worm, and hemoncosis is just a term for bad infections, and it's really a primary barrier that we have in our pasture-based systems. Um, and uh, and and also, you know, I would say that if you try to do the proper grazing management to optimize pasture quality and utilization, you're going to kind of run amok with parasite uh, infection issues, because you know you tend to you can't really separate the two, so it makes it a real challenge. So this could be, you know, an important trait for you to select for, particularly if you have, you know, lambs, you're trying to rear lambs on pasture. So is there a genetic solution to this issue of parasite infection? Certainly there are breeds that are selected in more equatorial regions of in the tropics that are going to be highly resistant to infection just naturally. That's how they survive there. But there are breeds, all breeds do have genes of resistance, even the ones that are from, you know, climates that were less exposed to homunculus. The heritability, which is really just defined as the amount of variation in a trait that's due to genetics, is high. So between 30 and 50% of the variation you see in parasite infection is due to genetics. So that tells us that you could do a lot of, you could be very effective in your selection if you knew what the susceptibility of a particular ram or ewe is to parasitism. Happily, there are some estimated predicted differences for parasite resistance that many breeds have. So if you look up NSIP, look at the breeds. There are several breeds where you can get numbers, actual quantitative numbers of how susceptible particular rams are within each breed are for parasite infection. And by using some of those selection parameters, you could improve the resistance of your flock.
There is a question, you can explain a little bit more what are the APTS? Some people, they don't know about that.
Yeah, I don't like using acronyms, but EPDs, it's just a measure of what's called genetic merit. Okay, so estimated predicted difference is it would tell you like how, if you bought a particular ram, it would give you a sense of how much, like if it has estimated predicted difference of, I don't know, 10 pounds at weaning weight, that'd be a huge predicted difference. That would tell you that their offspring of that ram are going to be a certain amount higher than average in that particular trait you're selecting for. So for genetic susceptibility to parasites, they have them listed as basically as fecal egg counts. So the lower the fecal egg count, that means that animals from that particular ram are going to have lower fecal egg counts. And so those numbers have direct bearing on the phenotype, the actual appearance or the performance of the offspring. So there are breeds also that are naturally resistant. As I mentioned, here's just some pictures. There's this group of sheep are from the Gulf Coast. This is like a funny kind of breed. They almost look, it's kind of hard to imagine this being a breed because they look so different, but they are a fixed breed that basically are almost feral sheep in the southern United States that would have been in an environment very conducive to the growth of Homunculus contortus. They tend to be far more resistant to parasites than other breeds. Then we have breeds that came from West Africa. Originally, the Gen X do, although they were fixed more in the Caribbean, for example, the St. Croix breed. And then we have the Katahdin, which curiously comes from the state of Maine, but they have a lot of hair sheep genetics from the Caribbean in their breeding, which allows them to be hair sheep and also gives them some superior resistance to parasites. But you can, like your Suffolk sheep, your polypay sheep, all have resistance genes. The starting level is different than these resistant breeds, but it is possible to make progress in all breeds. Here I show a slide from Australia to illustrate this concept. This is some work done by Laurie Piper, who was a prominent breed geneticist working particularly with sheep in New South Wales and Armidale, Australia, at their CSIRO research center there. Excuse me. And what she's done is she selected for animals that are more susceptible to parasites. Sounds crazy, but she did, just as a kind of proof of concept. Then she also selected ewes that were more resistant. And then she just had this control group that weren't selected for parasitism at all. And she measured fecal egg counts. FEC stands for fecal egg count. So this is the concentration of eggs in the feces of sheep. Pretty good indicator of infection. She did this under several generations. So we're talking close to 15 years here. And these are in merino sheep. I'll tell you, if ever raised merinos, they're very susceptible to lots of things. They're not a very hardy breed. But so she's showing us here that she got clear separation after several generations of sheep. These susceptible animals had higher fecal egg counts. The resistant flock had far lower fecal egg counts. It looks like by the end of the selection period, they were almost 4 times different. with the unselected flock right in the middle. So that just shows you that the power of this. It takes time. It's not a magic solution. You'd have to commit to this pretty fully to see some differences. This doesn't mean the resistant flock doesn't need to be drenched, but they probably don't need to be drenched as often. And so that can make a pretty big difference in your management and your productivity of your flock. Okay. All right. So I think I've got a few
Dr. Hart,
polls. Yes.
Dr. Ehrhardt, there's a question in the chat box. Will
Yep.
it be possible to get the link of this paper?
Oh, this paper?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd have to look that up, but I can't get that right off the, bang right to you right now, but I can send it to the, the leaders here, and you can look at that. Yep, sure. I just don't have it at the tip of my fingers here. I'll remember that. Okay. Why don't I play a few polls, launch a few polls and take a little short, I guess you call it a break. We have a lot more to talk about, but let me get the poll. I will see how this launches. It looks like there's two questions. I'll see if they launch together or not. Do you see the first poll question? Yeah. So the question is, which of these traits does not impact lambs marketed per ewe per year? There is seasonal fertility, conception rate, litter size, and growth rate. So this is lambs marketed, not pounds of lambs, just like number of lambs. Oh, you can see the whole thing. I'm sorry. On my poll. So I guess there's two questions at once. So that's question one. Okay. I'll just take a little more time here. Apologize. I didn't realize you could see both questions. The second question is, which of these diseases is most likely to enter your flock on four legs? Actually, I'll save that one. Okay. I realize now that that's supposed to be at the end of the talk. So go ahead and answer it now. We'll cover it. I'll come back to that one. Let's just start off with the first question, and we'll come to the second one later. Okay. And I'll just replay it again. It's no big problem. It looks like the vote, you're still answering the questions. That's fine. You can skip question two for now if you'd like. We had a little bit of problems getting these polls set up. So sorry if it's a little confusing. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the first. I'm going to end the poll for now. Maybe I'll replay it later, and I'll share the results. And for the first question, which is what we're going to focus on here, most of you, in my opinion, got the right answer, which is growth rate. So growth rate's really not going to impact lambs marketed per ewe per year, but certainly litter size is going to be a big factor, conception rate, and on a per year basis, if you're, considering seasonal fertility, it can have a big impact. It's kind of conditional. If you're an accelerated program, you would definitely see an impact of seasonal fertility. Okay. I'll come back to the disease ones. Apologize for that. Not realizing that was there. So I think I'm set. I'm going to keep moving then. And we talked about the selection for resistance here. Let me go to the next second chapter of the talk. And these are diseases of economic importance that can walk into your flock. Okay, so that's an important factor. So this is a lot about being aware of these diseases and trying pretty hard to avoid them. Foot rot would be a primary one. And then you could argue foot rot's a chronic disease, but I'll call these other ones chronic diseases. One's called OPP, ovine progressive pneumonia. It's a very close cousin in goats. It's called caprine arthritis encephalitis, or CAE. I'll probably use the word OPP most of the time, but CAE is a very, very similar retroviral disease. Has a few different symptoms that you don't see in OPP, but a lot of them are similar. Then we have Johne's disease, and then CL or CLA, which is caseous lymphadenitis. So let's talk about foot rot first. Now, foot rot's caused by a specific bacterium called Diclobacter nodosus. It survives in living hoof material a long time, pretty much indefinitely. So sheep can carry this and not even really be infected or look infected, which is a problem. And outside of the hoof keratin, though, it doesn't survive very long at all. In fact, if it's not in hoof keratin, it might only survive a few days. People say 7 days is a nice round number, but it's probably even less than that. But if you have a bunch of hoof trimmings, like sitting in your farm, it can live in those hoof trimmings for a long time. There's another bacteria called Fusobacterium necrophorum that's present in soil. And this is more of a facilitative role in foot rot. This will kind of do a little bit of damage to the hoof, not very severe, and be permissive in allowing this Diclobacter nodosus to enter. So people who have foot rot in their flock tend to see far less problems when they're not on pasture, because they don't have Fusobacterium necrophorum as present in their manure pack, but it certainly is in the pasture. So this is going to be really a common disease anywhere in the world. You have a lot of rainfall, USA and other places as well. You know, if you go out west, for example, in dry regions of the country, for example, they won't have a problem with foot rot because they just don't have enough wet season to really create issues. Diagnosis in foot rot is based on clinical symptoms only. There's no lab that I'm aware of in the United States that will actually do testing. We've developed, other people have too, developed a DNA test to detect the bacteria, which is very effective, but it isn't commercially available. It's a big problem everywhere in the world. Poor weight gain, poor conception, and there's just a lot of work associated with treating animals for foot rot. It's a pretty draining enterprise. Okay. So there is variation in what foot rot looks like. So that's why sometimes this is a confusing disease. You can score them, a score 1 to 5. 5 is really bad, 1's not too bad. 1 looks like this, where you just basically have this inflammation of this tissue or hair or skin interdigital area between the toes. You can see it's inflamed here. There's a little bit of reddening here, but there's very little invasion into the soft keratin of the hoof. It's mostly interdigital. Some people would call this, as a clinical condition, foot scald. But tell you what, this is not truly foot scald. This is actually a form of foot rot that's just not as invasive. Then here's score 3. This is a more invasive strain of Diclobacter nodosus, and this causes, this full-blown proteolysis of the keratin of the hoof. So it's basically dissolving all of this protein in the hoof, and this is kind of halfway dissolved. You can see that, and it's kind of starts at the heel and goes forward. This has been trimmed, so you can kind of see that necrotic tissue. This sheep has nice, healthy looking keratin, doesn't it? But it has this interdigital area. So that's what those two look like. So this is kind of a complex slide, I realize, but basically when you have moisture and trauma, you get softening of this interdigital zone. If you have this facilitative bacterium in the soil, you'll get, in the presence of Diclobacter nodosus, you get foot rot. There's different strains of foot rot. Some are very virulent that cause these really intense scores, these bad infections. And you have some that are more superficial, other strains that have a different gene, a different variation of this gene, that are more benign. This looks a lot like another condition called foot scald, and they're often confused. It isn't too important in some ways well, the only important part is this is not contagious to other sheep. This is. So that's the important part, but they're often confused. In fact, when we look at flocks, most people who say they have foot scald actually have benign foot rot because it looks the same. Okay, then there's the other foot problem you have, not to confuse it with these problems, is our foot abscesses, which is very different. That's just basically a soil-borne organism. For example, Actinomyces pyogenes would be one anaerobic bacteria that can just invade the hoof. You get a small puncture wound, like in the fall when the sheep's hooves are soft and they step on a some stubble in a pasture. They might get that's very common to see foot abscesses, and they shouldn't be confused with foot rot or foot scald.
You're asking what about the goats?
Goats, exactly the same situation. They have all of the same conditions, so it's perfectly analogous, goats and sheep, in this way. So,
Thank you.
Yep. I would argue that foot rot control and eradication, you need to establish a quarantine protocol and soak all your purchased animals in saturated zinc sulfate. So that's a salt that really dries out feet. And soaking, by means soaking, saturated means it has to be so much in the water that basically it comes out of solution. And I could send you an article if you'd like on these particular protocols. I don't have time today as an overview to go into them in great detail. So you can eradicate this disease, but it's a lot of work. You have to really focus on repeated soakings of feet in zinc sulfate, and also then minimizing reinfection risk. And what does that mean? Well, you don't want to put the sheep back on the same pasture you just took them off of after you soaked their feet. I've helped probably 15, 20 flocks eradicate foot rot. Some got rid of it as soon as 1 year. Some took 12 years to get rid of it. And it just took a lot of patience and persistence, a lot of use of zinc sulfate. There's also, which is a pretty safe approach, you could also use formaldehyde or formalin. I don't recommend it because it's very, very hard on hooves and it's also a carcinogen, but it is another route of foot bathing. And again, just to say, a lot of cases of foot rot or foot scald are actually foot rot, and both are treatable. So if you do have foot scald, if you've got sheep that have interdigital dermatitis, just soak them in zinc sulfate and be done with it, because that will clean them up pretty quickly. And I would argue that keeping a pasture-based flock free of foot rot should be a high priority, because it's really going to lower your ceiling of profitability. All of the farms that are thriving, I would say, in particular in my part of the world, have paid a lot of attention to this and made sure they didn't bring foot rot into their flock. They're very vigilant about buying rams from flocks that are foot rot free, and making sure they don't have visitors come in with dirty boots and so forth. And that makes a huge difference in their production efficiency. So I'm going to move on to the next disease. Sometimes these talks are kind of depressing because I'm just talking about bad things, but I want you to be aware of them. Is OPP. So OPP is a retroviral disease. CAE is its analog in goats. It was first reported in Texel sheep, which are a continental breed in the Netherlands a long time ago. It's actually Zwoegterziekte is the Icelandic term for the disease originally, and it literally translates into labored breathing or sickness. We found that OPP is the same as another disease called Maidi-Visna. So if you go to another part of the world, even Canada, they'll call it Maidi-Visna. They won't call it OPP. They're all the same disease. It has a lifelong infection. There is no cure. So that's the hard part. Animals tend to become infected post-weaning. They can become infected right from their mom, but more commonly, they're actually infected after they're weaned. And then when they're brought back, so, the way most people raise their sheep and goats is they'll, wean them off their mom, grow the replacements for a few months until they get big enough. And then right about the time they want to breed them for the first time, they might bring them in with the rest of the flock. That's the time they tend to get infected. So they become infected often before a year of age, but they usually don't show clinical symptoms for several years. So it's this progressive disease. It takes a few years to progress to the point where you see some of the symptoms, which I'll show you next. So one of the main symptoms is just, really low body condition. And the lungs, the animal's lungs fill with connective tissue, or basically the epithelial cells are destroyed. And so they become like a patient with emphysema. They're not compliant. The animal has a hard time breathing. So it used to be, before they had tests for OPP, they had just run the sheep around inside a barn, and the sheep that kept breathing heavily after a little exercise, you knew had OPP. Here's a picture of an udder. It looks like a normal udder, perhaps. It's kind of grainy, I know, but what if you were to touch this udder, you'd see that it's equally consistent, both halves of the udder, but it really isn't secreting any milk. So it kind of looks normal, but it's kind of hard and turgid to the touch, not soft, and just a little bit of milk. And it's the same thing. The epithelial cells that secrete milk are destroyed, and people call this hard udder syndrome or indurative mastitis. And that's a common thing you see in sheep production, is having this condition leading to lambs that starve. Or the other thing you'll see is some arthritis. This is a picture of a goat, obviously, maybe slightly more common in CAE than in OPP, but I certainly see it in OPP as well. Well, you'll see lameness like this and swelling of the joints. So to control it, screening all new flock introductions with a sensitive test, such as an ELISA test. There are a couple out there. Some are a little more sensitive than others, and maintain a strict quarantine protocol, meaning that you want to hold these animals until you get test results back. Ideally, and I don't want to sound too cautious here, but it is a fact that it's better to do a couple tests and quarantine them for a lengthy period of time if you're really uncertain of their origin. I generally test once, but if you want, in a perfect world, you test maybe 3 months apart twice, because it takes a little while for the antibodies to develop after infection. So it's possible you could buy a sheep that just became infected but won't show antibodies yet. And just to be super safe, if you wanted to really cover your bases, you might think about isolating them for a little longer, although it's not very practical to do that. Eradication is certainly possible. I've helped several flocks do this, but it is expensive and takes a lot of time and discipline. And as just a real basic principle, permanently isolating ewe lambs. So you might choose just to start a new flock. And one way you can do that that's not too expensive is basically keep all your ewe lambs separate from the rest of your ewes, which is the trick, and then test those. And generally, if you isolate the ewe lambs, only a very small number, even in a flock that might be 30 or 40% infection rate, a very small number will be infected. And you can just test those and get rid of them. They won't spread it to their cohorts yet, because they haven't been infected very long, because they're just ewe lambs. And that's a pretty good avenue to get rid of the disease. There is also a gene called TMEM154 that confers resistance to OPP. So sheep that have a certain copy of this gene, because there's variation in the coding for this gene that you can find in the sheep populations of the world. There's a particular pattern that's pretty common, luckily, that is more resistant. Like, I can't remember, I don't have the data in front of me, but it's probably 10 times as resistant over lifetime. So it doesn't mean that they won't get OPP. They're just a whole lot less likely. So if you don't want to go through all the expense and hassle of testing, you might want to start buying sheep that have TMEM154 testing. And that's a pretty simple, easy thing to do. And that'll certainly help. And OPP's, just like foot rot's, going to put a ceiling on your flock profitability, particularly flocks that are housed indoors. So, I've seen some farms that have had pasture-based farms, OPP levels like in the single digits. They've tested. They put them indoors to start like an accelerate system or an indoor lambing system to intensify their production. In 1 year, they go from single digits to like 30%, just because those animals are housed more closely together, and they're breathing each other's air, which they aren't their ventilation's never quite as good indoors as it is outdoors, and you tend to see spread and bigger problems. So I think this is the last disease I'm talking about. No, there's two more. So I'll try to move through this quick. Johne's disease. This is caused by a bacterium that survives a long time in the soil. It can infect pretty much all ruminants. There's cattle, sheep, and goats. The cattle usually can get any of the strains, but pretty much not as common to get the sheep one. The sheep mostly get the sheep strain, but can get an intermediate strain as well. So there is some variation in the strains. What does Johne's look like? It's a little like OPP in the sense that you see animals that have lost body condition. They're kind of subject to ill thrift. And then they also have diarrhea, especially when they're truly clinical. So the main route is from feces to young animals. So OPP spreads from adults to young stock, usually less than 6 months of age. It can also occur via colostrum and placenta transfer, but it's not very common. So that's not something I put a whole lot of worry into. What the bacterium enters the animal and evades the immune system. And so that's the problem in detecting it. Animals can become infected, but they don't really have much antibody production. And progression to clinical symptoms to actually look sick can take a long time. I've not seen clinical symptoms in lambs under 10 months of age. I have seen it in a few lambs that were just under a year of age a couple times. Stress is going to advance the disease progression. So if you have infected animals and you feed them outside in the winter, or you put them through a breeding season and a lactation, that's when you start to see more problems. So the problem with Johne's, unlike OPP, is that whole herd flock testing really isn't justified because we just don't have the right tests to do those yet. So you can't really do a test and cull program. So what you can do is just simply screen for animals that have unexplained weight loss. Bottle jaw is another symptom. I know bottle jaw is also a symptom of parasitism, but if you deworm all your sheep and they still have bottle jaw, I'd test them for Johne's disease. And then I would just confirm if they have these symptoms that they have Johne's by running a blood-borne test. And make sure you call all those positive animals and their offspring right away and isolate them. And then minimize the exposure of your young animals. So have thick bedding until you get rid of this disease, and keep those replacement ewe lambs away from older animals, kind of like OPP in that regard. Another way people have commonly got Johne's disease is through bringing cow colostrum into their flock. I brought it into my flock actually quite a long time ago, and I managed to get rid of it by doing that exact thing, by borrowing or getting some free cow colostrum from my neighbor, not knowing they had Johne's. Fortunately, these days, many dairies test for Johne's, and you can get, Johne's free colostrum. Okay, so this is the final disease I'm going to talk about, and I won't try to rush it, but I'm really running short on time. So CL, caseous lymphadenitis, I guess I spelled it wrong on top, ignore that. Lymphadenitis is, I got an extra S, inverted S up there, it's caused by a bacterium that evokes a strong immunological response. So the animal tries to fight it and kill it, but it's hard for it to kill because it's got a really rich, thick cell wall full of fat. And so what instead you get are just these big abscesses. So the body's trying to kill this organism, it's developing all this pus basically to get rid of it. So you get these big abscesses. These abscesses are focused around external lymph nodes. So it comes from animal to animal contact because these abscesses will burst and spread the contents into the environment. But also inanimate objects, the fancy term for that is fomites, such as shearing equipment, handling equipment, or drenching equipment can also spread the disease. So, because it can live in the environment for a while. So, if you're getting your sheep shorn, you want to make sure your sheep shearer has clean equipment. And I would recommend that you don't have them bring like their own piece of plywood. You supply your plywood and things like that for shearing to make sure you don't bring that into your farm, because like a carpet or plywood shear sometimes will harbor this organism really well. It can also spread as an aerosol. So you can unfortunately, they can even get this in their lungs, not as common, but it's possible, and I've seen it in killing animals and looking at their lungs. It can survive in the environment for a pretty long time, as I mentioned, especially under cooler, wetter conditions. So this is a little different than some of these other diseases. All age classes are highly susceptible to CL. Others vary according to age. So here's just your telltale CL abscess. This would be on this parotid lymph node, which is right between the ear and the base of the jaw, both on sheep and goats. And here's one just about to burst, and its contents will be in the environment and could infect other animals pretty quickly. You'll find them in this inguinal area because there's lymph nodes there. You'll find them right here in this prefemoral area, it's called. That's a common site of lymph nodes. You also find them on the shoulder of animals. The bacterium enters a wound and also at the base of the jaw. That's called the submandibular lymph node. So it enters a wound, it goes through the whole body, eventually evading the lymph system. It takes a few months to do that. And again, you're going to see these pretty much specific anatomical locations, although in really severe cases, you can see them more generally on the body, not just in these specific defined areas. You can also, in some cases, find these are more internal, but that's a little less common. And like the more of internal in the sense that you'll see sometimes the lung and the liver with lymph nodes, but less common, as I said. Abscesses are kind of hard to differentiate, but in general, they'll have a particular type of pus. Sometimes that'll harden and become a little more firm, but generally it's kind of a thicker kind of consistency to it. So they can be identified by their location and appearance. There's other things that can cause these abscesses, but if they're associated with the anatomical location of lymph nodes, then you should definitely consider that as a major possibility. There's serological testing that can be done. There's a particular antibody that's produced to the exotoxin, and it can be identified by the SHI test, SHI. But the problem with that test, and I don't recommend it, is that you can get high SHI results to other things besides CL. So it's not very specific. Definitely the best test is the culture of the organism at a lab. So you take this pus, take it to your veterinarian and say, I'd like to have this tested for CL, and that'll tell you whether that abscess is just a random infection or if it's from CL. Okay. So calling those cases is important. You can lance these abscesses, but it won't cure the animal. It'll just maybe slow the spread. So as far as a vaccination protocol goes, there are a couple of vaccines available, one for sheep and one for goats. The one from Colorado Serum Company for sheep works pretty well. I've had several farms eradicate or really control this nicely using this vaccine. There's also a specific CL bacterium made for goats that you can get from Texas Vet Labs. And I've seen this work pretty well, but it takes persistence. You'll get a reduction in incidence every year, and over time, you'll get down to just a couple cases and eventually get rid of it. It doesn't happen overnight. Okay, so to summarize then, our general strategies to control and prevent disease start off with awareness. Hopefully I've given you a sense of some of the symptoms, the transmission risks, and a little bit about the testing options. Understand that you should source stock from clean flocks. I know that's hard because not everyone does this testing, but ask a few questions before you buy your ram. Biosecurity, establishing a farm plan is pretty important. I would say, having a closed flock is a huge way to reduce your risk. It's a powerful way to protect your flock. But if you do buy new animals, you need to. I would suggest you isolate them for an extended period. I didn't talk about parasite management here necessarily, but part of that general quarantine should look at a deworming program using a dewormer from each of the major drug classes, dipping their feet in zinc sulfate twice, I would recommend, before you take them out of quarantine, and then just follow your typical vaccination plan for your flock. And then another part of it's establishing secure perimeter fencing. I've started a few farms and there are other neighboring sheep nearby. That's the first thing you want to do, is establish perimeter fencing so your animals don't commingle with others that might have some of these diseases that you've worked so hard to avoid. And then keep contaminated equipment and human feed off your farm. So just establish a protocol where once you get to a certain status, that you keep these diseases from walking onto your farm, even on 2 legs. All right, I know I kind of rushed that at the end, but I think maybe I could try to play this last poll if just show it again. See if I can, let me see this one. Yeah, so if you just want to answer question 2, which you started to before, I apologize for that, is which of these diseases is most likely to enter your flock on 4 legs? Looks like there should be an answer, all of the above. So I would choose C as all of the above, okay? Or it actually should be D, the last one. Okay, so it looks like 18 people answered the poll, and or actually there's a few more people. I apologize. Can wait a little longer. So does CL walk onto your farm in 4 legs? Does foot rot? Does OPP? Or do all of them? And it looks like you guys got the correct answer. The vast majority, you have it as all of them, because all of these are contagious diseases that you need to be conscious of when you select animals for your flock or herd. Okay, minimize that. Yeah, I know it's 6 o'clock. I'm not sure what you guys would like to do, but I'm happy to answer any questions that might exist.
Dr. Ehrhardt, there are a few questions in the chat. How long does CL bacteria lasts in the environment?
Yeah, precise. It has, I can't give a hard and fast answer because it depends on the environment. If it's dry and warm, not very long, like maybe just a few weeks. But if it's cool, like it is in the fall, and kind of wet, it's months. I've seen some scientific reports of up to 6 months. I don't think it's a lot longer than that, but it's a pretty long time.
There's another question. So talking about the prolificacy, how to avoid bottle feeding lambs or kids when we talk about proliferation?
Yeah. That's an important consideration, because as soon as you start artificially rearing a bunch of animals, you kind of suddenly run into a lot of labor and profit loss, right? Or profit stagnation. So that's why I talked about milk production. So I think anytime you work with prolific animals, you want to select for extra milk. And so, using rams of NSIP that have those high genetic merit tests or high EPDs for milk is important. This could be, I could talk about this for probably 45 minutes, this subject, but I would also argue that you can reduce the need to bottle feed lambs by getting rid of OPP. Okay, so OPP is, when I walk into a farm and I see they're rearing 25% of their lambs artificially, and they're only getting like 180% lamb crop, I'm very confident they have an OPP problem. So that's something to watch. So if you get rid of OPP, you're going to have a lot less bottle lambs to rear. And then there are other things to get rid of bottle lambs or artificial rearing would be considering things like grafting lambs. We do a lot of grafting on my own farm. It's not that it takes a little bit of a skill set to do that, but we'll need to artificially rear just 1% of our lambs because we're able to graft them. But that's the subject of a whole nother talk that would take a while to get into. But I would say as an overview, get rid of OPP, select for milk, and think about ways of maybe redistributing your colostrum by grafting.
The second question is, for the multi-species grazing like cattle with a sheep and goat, what disease can transfer with each other?
Yeah, so there's one risk concern with cattle and sheep that people are, I think it's called catarrhal fever, that is possible, but pretty unlikely to occur. And generally speaking, not a major risk. But there is one disease that you'd want to pay attention to, and you can actually test sheep for it.
Is CL a live vaccine?
No, it's a killed vaccine, CL. The only live vaccine I'm aware of for sheep is sore mouth.
CL vaccine is not available from Texas Vet Lab.
No. Yeah, I'm unfortunately, that doesn't shock me. I didn't look before I gave this talk. I know that availability kind of comes and goes, so that's too bad. I can't give you a report on that, but yeah. I'm not shocked to hear that. That's been, even the Colorado serum vaccine was unavailable for a few months once. So yeah.
Dr. Salinas, do you have anything to add?
No, just very interesting. I think the people
You're muted.
Dr. Salinas, you are muted.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you. Sorry. There are so many things so interesting. Just to know that once that you get the disease in your farm, to get it out is a crazy thing, and to preventing, to know the diseases and to be selecting animals once that you are carrying just to make some money. So it's very important to know all this stuff. So thank you so much, Dr. Richard, because you are talking very much about all the system, all the production system, and so how to be just selecting animals and to be taking care of them. So I think we are very important on this. So for the people, we don't want to take more time with the people, just thanking Dr. Ehrhardt, and also remembering that our next class will be till the Monday, December 4th with Dr. Steve Hart, and we are going to send also a survey for this talk. So we thank you so much, and we wait till next class. Now you have a very good Thanksgiving, Dr. Richard, Mohan, and everyone. Just enjoy these holidays and have a good time.
Thank you, Ehrhardt. Thank you, Dr. Ehrhardt.
You're welcome, and thanks for inviting me, and best of luck to everybody, and have a nice holiday.
You too. Thank you.